Before we get started, I highly recommend downloading these 4 things: GitHub Desktop, MongoDB Community, Node.js, and Visual Studio Code. I'll provide all 4 links below this video. The only one that's really required is Node.js. I happen to find that Visual Studio Code to be my favorite IDE, and it works really, really well. MongoDB Community is if you want to host your database locally, which I recommend, as it's going to be the easiest to manage. And then on GitHub Desktop, I just prefer to use Git as a versioning system when I work with code. I recommend you do it as well. Even if you're not familiar with Git, it's not too complicated, and it's something that you should be learning to do, especially if you're an aspiring developer. I've created a new repository, and I used Node.js as my ignore file. To do that, you just go to new repository, and I initialize it with README, and I chose Node.js. I'm not going to do that again because I've already done it. But right here, Node. But now we've done that, we're going to go ahead and hit open in Visual Studio Code. It's an empty project. It's got a README, a git ignore, git attributes, nothing too fancy. Once we had Node.js installed, we want to make sure that we've closed and reopened Visual Studio Code. The reason for that is the environment variables would not have loaded into the terminal here unless we had already closed it and reopened it after Node.js has been installed. We can test to see that Node.js is installed and working by typing node. If you give something back like welcome to Node.js and then a version, you're good to go. Now that we know that Node is working, let's go ahead and initialize our project as an NPM package. An NPM package is just an instruction booklet for all the dependencies that your project might have. For this particular package, we just have Express as a dependency, but Express has its own dependencies, and those dependencies have their own dependencies, and that can become a spider web of confusion trying to keep track of those. We can just hit enter through here if you've got your project working, you're not too worried about the naming conventions or anything like that. What that does is it creates a package.json. This is nothing fancy other than just some indicative data about your project, and once you start installing dependencies, it'll include an instruction booklet for how another computer can install those dependencies easily as well. In fact, let's just go ahead and install a dependency for our project right now to see what happens when we do that. So let's do an npm install save express. That save tells us it's going to be specifically to this package.json. And now you see there's a dependency for Express. Notice there's only one dependency. This isn't adding too much value. You could just say that elsewhere, but let's look at packagelock.json. That gives you a little bit more of a story here. You'll notice this includes a ton of dependencies, and that's because Express has a lot of its own required dependencies, and all those required dependencies might have some of their own required dependencies as well. And that's because NPM is doing a lot of this heavy lifting for us. So let's create index.js. And now that we have Express installed, we can do constant express equals require express. And we can instantiate an app of the Express class. And let's just define the port, because at the top of the class, or at the top of the file, it's a little bit easier to manage the port. And now I'm going to do something interesting that you probably haven't seen in a lot of Express tutorials. I'm going to create 2 different routes. If you've ever seen an API that's commonly changing, or an API that is following best practices, you might notice that there's versioned APIs, like version 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And they're running in parallel. So you can call version 1 or version 2, or you can call version 5 or version 6. And the reason for that is so that you don't have to align and deploy your code every time they make a change. You can still use the older version until it gets deprecated. If you want to upgrade your version, you just have to create a new route, and you can leave the old version up for a period of time, say a couple of months, and then you just notify your customers or your other people that are using your API to say, hey, version 1 is going to be deprecated in a few months. Be aware. We're going to set these up as middleware. We're going to add the routers as middleware on API v1 and API v2. So version 1 is obviously going to be found on the route API v1, and we'll do the other one API v2. What this means is if I were to go to API v1, my request would be routed through this router. If I were to go to /API v2, it would be routed through this router. So let's just show an example here, v1.get/ping. And the request response will come back with a response.status of 200.send successful. And then we would have our app.listen at port. And we could go ahead and have a function here just to say console.log listening. Just something to let us know that this app.listen was successful and I moved on. Node index. And let's go to our browser and try localhost/API/v1 ping. Successful. Great. I don't have a v2 yet, so if I go to v2, I get nothing. Cannot get API/v1/ping. And change this to v2. And instead of sending a successful, we're gonna send it as a JSON payload. Success, or we'll just say ping. And then we're gonna give some more data. Name of the requester, we're gonna say every requester's name is Eric. So now if we run it, and we try to call v2, we should get a JSON object, ping successful name Eric. We can still run v1, but v2 is now the updated or the cooler version or whatever you want to say. So this is how you can kind of version your APIs, and you can allow people to continue to use older versions while still developing newer versions and deploying those to production. Let's go ahead and let's migrate this ping, specifically this function, to a separate file because that'll just be best practice. Let's create a new folder called services, and let's create a new file called ping.js, and let's just copy this code, request, response, blah, 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 into that file. And so we'll just do constant ping equals that, done, and we'll do module.exports equals ping. And now, instead of here, we can say constant ping equals require services/ping, and this will route to ping.ping. Doesn't make too much sense. If we were to, so what we're saying is we're creating an instance of this ping file, and then we're taking this request, sending it to the ping file instance, and the ping file instance is ping function, which is exported through the modules. So if we were to instead of doing this as the ping file, we could actually just import the method itself directly and do the same thing. So now if we do this, it should function identically. We should still get on v2 the same payload, and it does. We get it. You don't see much change because it's supposed to be the same payload. But now we've kind of organized some of our logic. This isn't too important here because it was a one-liner. But as your routes start to get more and more complex, it's a good idea to keep these modularized so that if you need to modify something, you don't have to look through thousands of lines of code. You just have to look through maybe 100 lines of code, and that's a lot easier to manage. In the next video, we're going to look at setting this port as an environment variable and then setting the stage for using environment variables across our project.